All right. Hey, everybody. This is Luke with the Luke Humphrey Running Podcast, back with another episode. And I am just going to apologize right away because I have had a cold and congestion for the last 4 or 5 days. I feel like I'm better, but I know as soon as I start talking, my throat gets scratchy and I'm probably going to cough a fair amount. But I think with the way things are set up now, we can weed those out quite a bit better. You don't have to listen to me hacking. Today, what we want to talk about is fall marathons are ending, and then spring marathon training will begin, I don't know, January for most. And so I want to talk a little bit about what to do between now and then, right? I think that's a big area that we can get some things right, and we can make big jumps this spring if we handle our winters in the appropriate fashion. So with that, let's get right into it. So right now with a lot of my athletes, there's already a spring date in mind, right? So Boston's always a big one. I have some people who deferred to go to London next year or waiting to get in, something like that, and then obviously where I'm at, Detroit area, you have Toledo, same weekend as London, weekend after Boston, and lots of stuff. I mean, there's tons of races in the spring, right? Timing will be similar for them, which is great because then we can speak in general terms here. Oh, like for Boston, we're looking at a 14-week segment for the people around Boston is going to be January 12th. So, that's when we're starting our Boston Marathon training group, which will run from there January 12th through week after, usually the week or so after Boston. We make sure everybody's taken care of, go through race results, things like that. So I like doing that. If you want to be part of that, I will have links down below in the descriptions and stuff like that. So I would love to have you join. If you're running Boston, we have new plans made up, really good 14-week plans that will take into account the course, but keep the philosophy the same. I think because I've already started getting questions about adjustments that they can make. This takes care of all of that for you. So consider that as you get through the fall here. And if it is something that's going to interest you, we're actually going to, this podcast actually was inspired by a full discussion we're going to have coming up in a couple weeks regarding Boston specifically, what I would do from, say, December through the marathon, how to apply certain plans and things that I would focus on. Stay tuned for that as well. But it will be a very in-depth discussion, and a lot of the stuff we're talking about today kind of stem from that, because I realized there's a lot of marathons in April we can talk about more than just Boston. So, but when you're deciding what to do, I think what you really have to focus on is your specific needs and reflect on your race this fall. And then you can consider some of the scenarios that I'm going to talk, really two of the scenarios that I'm going to talk about coming up here. So that's really what I want to do, because I want you to take what you learned and realize what you're good at already for the marathon. And then given that, we can apply certain things to help improve what you're not so good at and hopefully make those bigger jumps in the spring. So given that, let's look at the first scenario. First one I would say is you want to run a faster marathon, but your shorter races show that you can go faster, right? So you've run a 5K and a 10K, and they all suggest you can run much faster in the marathon than what you have. So what I would look, and we're making some assumptions, right? Like I'm assuming that you're not overtraining and everything I'm talking about today. So you're not overdoing it on workouts. You're not pushing the pace on the easy days. You're handling the schedule like you should. Because if not, those are obviously the things I would look at first. Like, let's fix those first. But probably a bigger problem for the media use would be that in this scenario, that your weekly volume actually lines up with what you want to try to accomplish in the marathon. So, and I don't think it's as bad as maybe what even I myself have made out in the past. I've got more years. A lot of the stuff, like I said, I've put out years ago, and I didn't have a big database to pull from. But I've been doing this for 20 years next May, which is crazy to think about. So we have a lot more people that we can pull from. So I've got a blog post on this as well. But basically, if you're running to run 4 to 5 hours, my bare minimum that you should be able to tolerate week in and week out is 35 miles a week. And I think you should be able to go north of 40 on peak weeks. If you can't do that, we've got to get to that point where you can. And then if you're running around 3.5 to 4 hours, I really feel like you should be able to handle 40 to 45 miles a week in, week out, and 50 miles a week at peak. Moving down 3 to 3.5 hours, I would say 50 to 55 miles a week on a regular basis. And then for under 3 hours, I would say you should really be able to run over 60 miles a week on a regular basis, with peak weeks, 5 to 10 miles north of that. And I think if you can do that, then your mileage lines up with what you actually want to run as your goal time. So if you hear those numbers for where you want to be in the marathon and you struggle to hit that weekly volume, pretty good chance that's your underlying issue. And so what I will see with a lot of times with people is, like, they'll think they'll need to work on speed over the, November, December, January. Truth is, we got to be able to tolerate more volume, and we can do that without speed. So we can definitely work on that stuff. So that's where my first consideration would be, because what we can do is we could use a base building plan, and we could build your volume fairly quick because we're not putting a lot of effort on intensity, right? It's usually when you're focusing on two of those things that we're going to be getting in trouble. And considering, like, say, if you've already did a plan where you run 6 days a week, we're running 5 to 6 days a week. We've already accounted for that. We're taking the intensity out. So the only variable that we're really changing is the amount of volume that you're doing. And if we're running easy enough, we're not putting enough stress on the legs that you can't recover from that. It's when you're putting the stress from more volume and then an even greater stress from more intensity is where you get into problems. And then the nice thing is, if you're in a harsh winter climate, then it takes some of the injury factor out as well, because you don't have to have access to certain things. Like, we're not you don't have to seek out a track. If you really don't want to run on an icy sidewalk, we can move it inside, get on the treadmill or something like that. So we have options to really keep you safe and healthy. So that's where my first line would be on that, is look at that weekly volume. If that's not lining up with where you want to be, let's get you in a base building plan where we can put that emphasis on the volume, take all the extra stuff out, and then come around when you start the marathon segment in January, you've already accounted for that too. So now you don't have any really new variables that you're trying to introduce in your training, because you've taken care of all the ones that were the problem. And now you can jump into a marathon segment, and you don't need another 18-week segment because you just spent how many weeks building that up, and you can go right into a 14-week plan, start workouts, and you're going to do very, very well. And you've keeping it so that's not a continual cycle of doing workouts and then making your segment way too long and being burn out by the time you get to the peak week. So that's where I would consider. Now, for the second scenario, let's say you want to run a faster marathon. You handle the volume okay, but shorter race times don't really line up. Your 5K, 10K don't line up with where you want to be. I've had people want to run a certain time, and they've never even run a half marathon faster than that they want to run a marathon at. So that obviously makes things harder, right? And so that would be our next thing that we could potentially look at if this sounds like you. So in this scenario, what we probably need to work on is things like lactate threshold and critical velocity. So essentially 10K to 20K pace and 5K pace, right? So if you can improve those, that's going to make marathon pace feel so much easier, because in that situation, what's probably going on is that your marathon pace is probably just too close to what your lactate threshold pace is, and it's just not sustainable. And that's when wheels start falling off fairly early in a marathon. So like if you're already struggling at like 16, 18 in the marathon, and you're in that situation where those other races don't really line up with it, I would say that this is probably a big concern for you. So obviously my advice here is to do something that's going to make you faster. And it depends on the timing of your race and the length of time needed to train for that. Like if you're running Cal International and then you're going to turn around in January and train for, a spring marathon, it probably doesn't make sense. You don't have enough time. It makes more sense just to recover and then jump in, and we'll have to figure out when to do that, probably in the summer. But if let's say you ran Chicago and you have from now until mid-January to get ready, you have plenty of time where you can recover, build up your volume back up to your baseline level. And then you might have 6-8 weeks or even longer, maybe even up to 10 weeks where you could just do a full dedicated speed segment. Now, over the winter, it might be hard to find races, but we don't necessarily need to race faster. We just need to do the work that's going to make us faster. And so if racing is not that important to you, then we could just do this segment and you'd still have made the progress. Now I get it. Like you don't necessarily know what you can actually run in those races, but it would be the work necessary to make those races faster, which would hopefully build the confidence you need and make you feel better when you actually start marathon training, that things would go much, much better. And I think how you approach it depends where you're at too, right? So if you are in a cold winter climate and, you have icy sidewalks, you don't have access to a track, if you're not willing to get on a treadmill, that makes things a lot harder, right? Like you really limit yourself on what you're actually going to be able to do. Like I have different blocks. Like I have 6-week speed blocks. I have 6-week hill blocks. If you have access to hills and things like that, we could do the hill block, and that would actually help you. It's going to make you faster because it's going to be the intensity that you need, even though you're not necessarily running faster. It's going to make you stronger, and it's going to do what you want to do. It's just going to be a roundabout way to do it. But it will make you a better runner in the next segment. But if you live in a southern climate, like I have a lot of athletes in Florida and Texas and Missouri, things like that, where yes, it's cooler, but they don't have the snowfall. They still have access to tracks and stuff like that, where they could do a full on, speed segment and not necessarily worry about the stuff that like people in, upstate New York or Michigan or wherever, where, if you want to get on the track, you're going to have to get a shovel and get out there 2 hours earlier and shovel lane one off, which I've done. It's not going to happen too much longer. It's not going to happen all the time. I can tell you that. Once is a novelty, but then twice is a job. So, it gets old quick. But the point is, do something that's going to improve those measures, which then is going to make marathon pace feel easier, even if you don't have the race results that would back you up, on that. So just keep that in mind. But, ultimately, the keys for me that if you're training consistently all year, which most people listening to this, or if they qualified for Boston, I'm assuming that you're at least an intermediate runner, right? Like you've gone through this before. You know to some extent what you're doing. You know what certain terms are, things like that. I don't have to worry too much about starting at a 101 level at that. But given that, I don't think you need a full 18 weeks cycle. I think 14 weeks, a block of 14 weeks is plenty. For half marathons, I would say 10 to 14 weeks, depending on what you actually did. Like if you did base, you might want 14. If you did speed, you might only want 10 to 12 at most, because you've already done a lot of the components you would do in a 14-week half marathon cycle too. So, and that's the other thing too. If you did all those things earlier, you don't need to do it again with an 18-week cycle. You can cut that time out of there and you can move on a lot quicker. Focus on what's going to give you the most bang for your buck, right? Like if you're already good at mileage, we don't necessarily need to do that right now. We need to work on stuff that is lacking, and it puts you in a kind of a no pressure situation because we're just doing it to make our marathon better. We're not necessarily doing it to make our 5K faster, right? Whatever. But base blocks are great because you can focus on raising that baseline mileage that you can tolerate. And then once you're able to tolerate it, it just becomes a regular part of your schedule. And so you just kind of level up that baseline over time. All of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but it seems like it, over a year or two, you've gone from I can only run like 20 miles a week to where you feel like you're training at 30 to 40 miles a week, right? Like you actually feel like that's where you're at. And then you can go from there. Speed blocks are great because you can take the focus on things that many runners tend to start neglecting as they get older, just because they don't like doing it as much. And if you just come back for a little bit, it makes a big difference. But that's one of the biggest things I see like with older runners is they don't necessarily slow down because they're getting older. They slow down because they stop doing certain things. And I get that it's hard and it feels harder on your body. And then when you try to do it, it feels like your body is completely rejecting it, but that's just because you haven't done it in so long. But if you can reintroduce it at an appropriate level, you can make really big progress and not put your body into a tailspin. And then lastly on that, I think just over the winter, you always have things to consider, like what you're willing to do. I know some people just refuse to get on a treadmill. You have to consider the weather that you're going to be training in, what you're going to have access to. And then lastly, just stay healthy. If you can just stay consistent and make a little bit of progress, you're going to set yourself up so much better than if you just neglected everything because you didn't want to do it. And so it's easy to fall off. And then you're kind of back to where you started a little bit. And it just is a cycle of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And it just takes a lot longer to get where you want to be because you don't have that stepping stone progress. But in any case, that's it for today. But just some things to think about. I'll share some links to my 6-week blocks, things like that. can always just go to lukehumphrey.running.com and go to the training plans page. Lots of stuff there. I'll also share link to the Boston training group. Would love to see you guys out there for that. Get you in a good plan, get you access to coaching for a segment at a very, very reasonable price. Take advantage of that. I think it's a really good community as well. Just have a lot of fun usually. But that's about it for this week. And don't hesitate to reach out with questions if you're not quite sure how to set that up. But yeah, using blocks to build out, from now until January, and then plugging in a full 14-week cycle. Definitely a good way to go. It just can get tough over the winter. Just so much stuff working against us with a lot shorter days, working through the holidays, getting through the new year, all that stuff. And so we want to make it as easy as possible to stay on point with training, but not super stressed about it, right? So, all right, that's enough for today. I will talk to you all later. Thanks for listening, and talk to you next time. All right, see ya.